Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome in, everyone. I hope you all had some fun, because the last couple of days, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, has not been fun.
I'm not sure we have too many people now who listen to us who are on the Trump part of the political spectrum. Well, I did notice that awful man who runs Zeitgeist New Zealand, who's a promoter of the great replacement theory, was was full of enthusiasm, and I suspect that there's quite a few people on the right wing are going to pick up some of the signals from the Trump victory and apply them to Aotearoa.
There will be some emboldened people doing their thing all around the internets. But we have a show this week to talk about the fallout, what next, on things like climate, geopolitics, the economy even, and hopefully make some sense of it all.
Well, I think, Bernard, I thought we could do the whole lot on just sort of talking heads from Elaine Monahan, my journalist friend from Washington, D.C. She's going to be joining us. And, of course, our old friend, Professor Patman, who I see is talking to the ODT today, which I guess we have to excuse him doing things for the Otago Daily Times
local
since
paper.
He's there. Yeah. But you've got Catherine coming in, because I think, when we're talking about how we try to add value, that's a little bit different from what others are offering. I think the Catherine twist on climate and on climate change is potentially really interesting. I think Robert will be really interesting on AUKUS and foreign policy, and I think Elaine will be able to give us a sense of how it's playing out there. The good thing is I have in fact cleaned my office of all the stuff that was in it, so that if Elaine arrives, she's got a spare bed to sleep in.
And what happens when 200 million people turn up?
Well, that's right. Well, give me a little tight. But and you've got Craig Rennie coming in to discuss the economic aspects.
That's right. And also what's happening here locally. We actually can't influence the results overseas. We're sort of takers rather than makers on that. Mm-hmm. But certainly there's action aplenty in our political economy this week, not just with the government's finances. We've got some fresh numbers today, jobs figures from yesterday, but also the introduction of the Treaty Principles Bill, a big old middle finger to iwi and everyone else in Te Ao Māori. Today, and that you just get the sense that David Seymour's setting the government's agenda.
He sure is on this and on much else. It's real. I just sent you actually up. You probably haven't had time to read it since you were hauling yourself out of your budgie smugglers. But or actually you don't use budgie smugglers. So since you were covering up the, I presume you now drive naked in the Nissan.
No.
In the Nissan Leaf over to the thing, and just cut out the middleman and just go naked everywhere.
Barefoot is the best I can do. Yeah.
And I got this email from David Seymour today, because I've made the mistake of sort of tracking him now a little bit. In fact, it'd be nice to think I was stalking him rather than being aggravated by him. And I think this is going to be a really unpleasant 6 months, where, and again, I was looking at all of the people who compliment him on this and say, "You're damn right, we're really sick of the Maori of the Maoris, and don't forget the Morioris, and what about our own rights, and can we please get rid of Maori names on departments and things?" It just stirs up the worst of it. And I think one of the things, Bernard, that we should do more on, we've touched on it, is the question of the judiciary, because part of his contention here is that the judiciary has taken over the role of Parliament in interpreting the Treaty of Waitangi, and yet that is exactly the purpose of the judiciary in our constitutional setup. Whether you consider the Waitangi Tribunal to be part of the judiciary, which I think we now do because of some recent case where, but certainly the High Court, the Supreme Court and the Appeal Court have been, along with Jim Bolger and various other, national politicians, the arbiters in a sense, or the interpreters of where this goes. I just think it's incredibly sad, and I worry about the state of New Zealand. I'm bloody sure that David Seymour will gain some fuel from this.
Yeah, and unfortunately, he's being inspired by his colleagues within the Atlas network all around the world who've
Perhaps,
seen the
yep.
gains when you can bully, take over, influence, gerrymander the judiciary as well as the parliament and the executive.
Yeah.
And New Zealand's been relatively immune from political influence in our judiciary. But when we have cabinet ministers and party leaders, soon to be deputy prime minister, openly challenging the not just the authority of the courts, but their role
their
in
role,
society.
and this phrase, unelected judges.
Oh,
And of course, now we've got this. Actually, what we should do is, look at this thing in Mexico where all of the judges will be elected under a new constitutional shift, which is just, that's going to work absolutely brilliantly in a country that can't even control its own drug cartels. It's a very dark phase. I think we should do more on it, Bernard. I think we should try and get Chris Finlayson on. Francis Kinraid is saying, we need to get Mehdi Hassan on from the States. One of the things that people should know is that I think it's going to be 11:15, not 12:15 tonight when we have Elaine. It's quite tricky to get, important people like Elaine and Mehdi Hassan on at midnight to talk to a couple of hundred New Zealanders, even if it's a few thousand on the Saturday morning. And I do sometimes look for people from Chicago and, as you know, Europe. And Helen Clark decided not to come on today because it was 5 a.m. where she is, and I perfectly understand that. Although I would get up at 5 a.m. for Helen, of course.
yeah, I'm usually up at 5 a.m. anyway. But Peter, it's been a heck of a week, but a heck of a week for you too. Excellent piece in The Listener on the great story about Polish refugees who came here during the war and settled in. And you went to Payatu over the weekend. How did that go?
I did. Well, if you remember when we did the show last week, I don't know whether you ever listened, but I listened back to see how good Simon's edit is,
always excellent.
and whether my ex-mother-in-law is going to call me to say I shouldn't say Jesus Christ anymore. Although she did tell me the other day that she now watches it on YouTube so that she can see whether I'm eating my greens. But because
Simon has a macro now to remove the name of the creator. Yep.
Yes. So yes, I did. We talked about this because I was in Taupo last time, if you remember, and it was pretty amazing. I had a bottle of vodka with Mr. Markowski, the man who
not a whole bottle.
Well, yes, it was not a very big bottle, but he had 7 of his 10 children came, and so it was fairly easy to polish it off. And it was absolutely lovely to see him, to talk to him, and to talk to so many others of those Polish refugees. And now I'm really, or not yet, Polish kids. And what I'm really interested in at the moment, and I can't sort of get rid of it at the moment, is to really think about the diaspora of all of them. The Poles were, there were 15,000 or so that left Iran for various places around the world, scattered around the world. What happened to the others? We know a bit about what happened to the Payatuans, but what the nicest part was possibly Mr. Markowski. I introduced him to Dave Dobbin. So Dave,
really?
And I thought Dave Dobbin sang, various New Zealand classics of his. And I said to Dave Dobbin afterwards, have you got some connection to this? And he said, no, it's just, I almost never do this kind of thing, but I was so moved by the story that I thought I'd come and sing for them.
His song has become a sort of another national anthem.
Exactly.
And it is,
he seemed a very nice chap. But I introduced him to Mr. Markowski, so I have a lovely picture of the two of them.
Can you imagine?
When I gave Mr. Markowski the Zubrovka vodka, he took a little sip out of the cap because he's 92 and he's not apparently supposed to drink too much alcohol, and he sort of, that's as smooth as your mother's milk. Speaking of which, it's Catherine.
And we all need a vodka every now and again. And Catherine, it is wonderful to see you because, we're talking here about how New Zealand was a haven for refugees in one of the darkest times in the last century or two. Quite possible there might be some political refugees coming out of various places in the next wee while, not to mention climate refugees. So what is the outcome of this election result from a climate policy and climate point of view? Because there's a few worried people.
Yeah, it's not great. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, came out the other day saying that a second Trump-led withdrawal from the Paris Agreement would cripple the Paris Agreement. He compared it to losing a limb or an organ. So, and one of the things they're really worried about is that it will create leeway for a lot of other countries to, pull back on what their commitments and pledges are, not least because this is such a critical time for increasing, what we're trying to do with the Paris Agreement. If that doesn't happen, then we're in a lot of trouble going forward.
And the goals of the Paris Agreement align almost perfectly with the Trump. It's 2025 to get to agree to go down to 1.5, and then it's 2030, I think, to get a 43% cut in. It's not going to happen it's exactly within more or less exactly within the remit, or within the time period rather, of a Trump presidency.
Yeah, the timing is just incredibly critical. So, yeah, it's quite worrying from an international perspective. And I think, you could say the takeover of the COPs by petrostates in the this year and last year has already had a significant impact on the ambition of that particular agreement, which means that we have a lot more reliance going forward on the sort of pacts and agreements that people make outside of the UNFCCC process. So some of those bilateral agreements, for instance, between the likes of the US and China that we've seen in the past, critically important, but the chances of those are sort of
they
going
seem
down.
marginal, don't they? Although maybe we'll have an agreement with China because he's such a tough guy, and he likes to deal with the other tough guys.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what the basis of that agreement would be, given the policies that he's talking about implementing. So, that seems like there's less and less room for agreement, or places where those countries' interests intersect to create that kind of space for agreements, because that's really what all of this international stuff comes down to. It's like, where do our interests intersect enough for us to do that instead of prioritising national interest? And those places where our interests intersect seem to be reducing under presidencies like Trump.
Just putting my devil's advocate hat on, Catherine, Trump's been there before, 2016 to 2020. There were worries back then that emissions would increase under Trump because he was so pro-oil and gas and anti-green policies. But actually, US emissions fell. Maybe, again, his instincts will be thwarted, in particular by the states and by the sort of, momentum of the shift towards renewable energy. So is it possible that, Trump could say all this stuff and it actually doesn't matter?
Yeah, I've heard that argument quite a lot, and there is a certain amount of the emissions reductions in the US that are structural and that probably aren't going to be stopped by anything that Trump does. They're going to keep going. But the argument that states will continue to be able to act and to make up the rest of the difference, well, times have changed since Trump's last administration. So a lot of the action and the much stronger action that's been happening at state level over the last year or so has been down to funding from the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and Trump can very much turn that tap off. And so that has a direct impact and stymies what states are actually able to do at the moment. So that could have a much bigger effect on the steepness of the decline in emissions in the US than it did last time.
Bernard, isn't it also the case that COVID will have been a big contributor to emissions falling over that period, or not?
Yeah, that was only right at the end in that last year of 2020. There was plenty of economic growth over that period, although a lot of that economic growth was in low emissions areas, services, health, education, retail, hospitality, the factories haven't really gotten going. Interestingly, the Inflation Reduction Act of Joe Biden most of that money, which is coming from borrowing by the US government,
Yep.
is going into Republican states. And Trump has said he wants to dismantle the Inflation Reduction Act, and it looks like he's going to have both the House of Representatives and the Senate to help him do it. And it will be interesting to see whether the Republican states, the governors, the Republican Party, allow him to gut the Inflation Reduction Act, when it will actually hurt jobs and manufacturing and the transition in a lot of Republican states. You look at places like Texas, where there's
Yeah.
an enormous solar boom going on, which went
It'd
to
probably
Trump.
be
of course.
easier just to let it run, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and he certainly is not motivated by any need to get the deficit down or to get the
No.
or to reduce borrowing. He's all for increased borrowing. That's one of the ironies here, is that there'll be lots of people on the right in New Zealand who'll be saying, "Yay, Trump elected." What do you think of Trump's fiscal policy? Oh, I don't know. And New Zealand is pretty much the only conservative, let alone liberal, government in the world which is running a austerity policy on fiscal matters, which we'll talk about later on with Craig. Just one final thing, Catherine. The other argument is that it doesn't matter what Trump will do, the global finance markets and the climate itself will force Americans to do the right thing on climate, because so much of America will become uninsurable. The financial drivers will, force everyone's hand here. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, there's a couple of issues in there. I'm going to go for the second one that occurs to me, which is around this issue of the insurance, the unpriced risk in insurance markets, because that's particularly important to Aotearoa as well, seeing as we have so much of our assets invested in housing where that insurance risk applies. America is basically at a crossroads. They had two choices. They could either invest a lot of money in retrofitting their economy and their infrastructure and their disaster response so that they could deal better with this, with increasing climate impacts, or they can go down the disaster capitalism route. And down that route, what you get is you'll get a lot of dodgy or inadequate infrastructure repair. You'll get insurance scams where insurance companies will go bankrupt, declare bankruptcy the minute that they have to do a big payout. You'll get corrupt disaster relief and response. You will get all of the parasites, basically.
No, Trump insurance will sort all of that.
Yeah, draining, leaching.
Trump reinsurance, in fact.
Yeah, they'll basically leach any remaining money out of those hard-hit communities before the official abandonment happens. So that's a huge risk, and that will really affect a lot of the people that voted for Trump over the next few years. And it's really difficult to see him taking the other route, which is the expensive investment retrofit route. I think he will very clearly take the disaster capitalism route. That's the route that he and his billionaire cronies are most likely to profit from, and it will be the expense of everybody else. So,
Catherine, two questions before we go, if you don't mind, before we go to Elaine and Robert will be in, I'm sure, shortly. You mentioned the likelihood that Trump's probable hesitation or repudiation of the Paris Accords will give other countries an excuse to do the same or to backslide. Very interesting to see in the UK. There's a big push against net zero, or the net zero idea. What do you think New Zealand might do? The New Zealand coalition government might do? Are they just going to let it continue to slide the way they have so far?
I mean, we've been waiting for the other boot to land in terms of what this government's going to do to achieve its Paris Agreement targets. It'll be interesting to see, but my suspicion is that they're waiting for a flock that they can join.
Yes.
And this might well, be the momentum towards the creation of that little flock of, we're not going to meet our Paris Agreement targets and we don't care.
Yeah, I mean, all the actions of the government so far have been, we're giving lip service to the idea of we are going to meet our Paris Agreement targets, let alone the net zero law that passed. But in reality, you sense the thing that's not said by government ministers is, we're just going to wait until everyone else defaults and we'll default too. And then we can get away with not looking like Neanderthals on climate policy, and just look like the followers on climate policy, which we believe we are.
Exactly.
The problem, the price of failure has just dropped. the
Yeah,
price of failing to
exactly.
meet your
You mean
Paris
the
Agreement
political?
targets.
You mean the political
The
price?
political price of failing to meet your Paris Agreement targets just dropped after that election. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and even though in Europe and the UK they've built in the Paris agreements to our trade relations, you'd have to think that post-Trump, where these trade agreements are effectively held hostage to tariffs as opposed to what's happening in trade agreements, it all becomes redundant. Catherine,
Yeah, and
thank you so much.
interesting to see Ursula von der Leyen not going to the not the head of the EU Commission, not going to the COP, which of course is
Really?
in another petrostate. But
Yeah.
this I think we're getting ready to slide here, and I'm just going to go and start inflating my my
Lifeboat.
paddleboard. Yeah, and well, that's the best thing I've got for a lifeboat. Speaking of lifeboats, there's
Thank you
Elaine.
very much, Catherine. Cheers.
Elaine, you've had a fairly extraordinary. Let's just introduce you one more time to this audience, and we'll do it again. I'm sure Simon will include it for tomorrow. It's lovely to see you in your new super duper setup. It must have been quite an interesting 24 hours for you, given the job you do, given your politics to some extent. Tell us how you are initially, please.
Well, first of all, can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, we can.
Outstanding. So how am I? I think, even though I absolutely thought this was a possible outcome, and maybe even thought it was going to be the outcome, I think I'm still a little stunned, because it's obviously very hard to know that you are looking around at many people who have chosen a convicted felon to be their president. And that just, flies in the face of common sense. And of course, when you look more closely at what we know about how people voted and why, it stops looking quite so sort of surprising. But yes, people are in a state of surprise and shock, and I've heard people talking
Especially in
about,
Washington, D.C., I suspect.
Well, yes,
which is a very blue area.
It is. And I've heard people talking about plans to move or go back home to wherever they originally came from.
Peter is offering his
Well,
spare bedroom.
I
by the
actually,
way.
after months of procrastinating, I've cleaned my home office, and the bed which folds out to a double is here for you and Lee if necessary.
And
Thank you very much.
there's probably another couple 100 million who'll take up the offer
Exactly.
as well.
And we've got Professor Patman on with us as well. Robert, it's really good to see you.
Good to
We're
see
going
you.
to do
Hi,
the
everyone.
international affairs implications of that. Let me just pursue Elaine a tiny bit more. We talked, the demographics that we talked about last time do not seem to have played out the way potentially they were expected. Women do not seem to have voted for Kamala Harris the way we expected. There doesn't seem to be, according to the statistics I saw, this huge wave of young men that Elon Musk and others were encouraging. And yet there's also a very heavy Latino shift towards Trump rather than against. Because I think when we spoke last week, it was just after the Madison Square Garden event. That shifted my personal view. So when we spoke last week, I was pretty certain that Trump would win. I should have stuck with that. I didn't bet on it. That would be vulgar. But by the beginning of this week, I was thinking there is no chance that treating people like that, and also the weirdness of Trump in the last week in his, I just thought that was going to become infectious, but it didn't. Elaine, tell us how you see. I mean, everybody here will have looked at some analysis, but what are you taking out of this in terms of what was missed in the demographics and the polling?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in fairness to all of us who have been prognosticating about this and discussing it, in the end, it's still a very close vote. And as we've always said, it could go either way, and it went in Trump's direction. And, I think it's sometimes easy to forget when we're doing the horse race thing that we end up doing, because it's a 24/7, life we're all living. Just how short Kamala Harris's campaign actually was, and that she was carrying the burden of all of the unhappiness about Biden's presidency in addition to running a very fast race, in addition to not having policies with which she was very clearly associated, and trying to undo damage that had been done that had led to Biden becoming less popular in the first place. So, in fact, the fact that she did so well is itself quite surprising, I suppose, you could argue. But and the gender gap is definitely there. I mean, I'm just looking at the figures here. In terms of gender, it was very clearly still a gender divide, not as big as we might have expected. Yes. And, black women on Twitter or on social media are unhappy with white women who have voted for Trump. And I wonder whether the existence of these 10 abortion ballots that we had gave people the opportunity to vote on the one hand to protect abortion rights, and on the other hand to vote for Trump nonetheless.
Yes, which is a weird dichotomy, isn't it?
It does seem a little surprising, but as one of the strategists has put it in the last 24 hours, it was the inflation stupid.
Yes.
It
was very interesting. This because the Americans talk about that pocketbook idea, and I think I mentioned maybe a couple of weeks ago, James Sirowicki talking about how cheap petrol had gone down to $2.97 a gallon and how thrilled he was. The memory of the cost of living seems to be very strongly embedded, particularly in that kind of Americans call it middle class, but we would probably call it a working class vote.
Right. So yeah, I mean, of course, the inflation, the data about inflation, as usual, it just depends which numbers you're looking at, and it's measured in lots of different ways. And I feel like the kind of inflation and wages picture is as complicated as our electoral college picture is, and you really have to drill down almost to the individual lived experience to find out what it's really been like for people. But and I think it's possible that some people were looking for an excuse to vote for Trump, and the economic argument lent itself rather neatly to that decision. But at the same time, I think it's just simply a fact that a lot of people feel very that they're just not living as well as they perceive themselves to have been living.
Yes, and
4
it's
years
interesting
ago.
that I saw something about you can't sell people statistics. You can sell them an idea that they're worse off.
Right, and it was easy. Of course, it's very easy for Trump to say over and over again, inflation is through the roof, and make these kind of bombastic statements that are actually not rooted in fact at all. But Kamala Harris couldn't be busy saying, really, things are really not that bad. Like, that would not have gone down well. So she was in a bind there, and he was able to repeat the same, exaggerated version of things as often as he liked with no penalty.
And Elaine, before we deal with foreign affairs and bring Robert in, and you absolutely welcome to stay there. I want you to stay, in fact, because you will have a very serious perspective on Ukraine in particular. The woke mind virus that Elon Musk talks about, I'm picking up a lot from what I listen to, and think that was also a very powerful aspect, particularly on the male vote, the whole transgender debate, the idea that there was a kind of liberal totalitarianism, cancelling people, all of that kind of stuff. How big a factor do you think that is?
I think it's hard to measure. I think it's part of the zeitgeist, if you like. And I think that the economic decisions that calculations that people were making in the end are still the biggest thing by far, as well as immigration, which is part of the what's showing up in the exit polls as well. And that's sort of been part of the tension that has been running for actually years in the run up to this election. So I don't mean to set it aside, but I'm not sure that it wasn't already baked into how people were going to
I think
vote.
though that, Elaine, one of the things that I would say on that, and not that I have an analysis, but I do actually, or I have an opinion, which everyone has one of those, is that is one of the viruses that's going to spread out from this, that the woke thing. It's going to go to the UK. It's going to, Putin already does it. I actually hate the word woke because it's really only used by arseholes. and certainly in New Zealand. Let's think about foreign affairs. And Robert, I read your piece or your interview in the ODT today. I was appalled that you talked to your local newspaper before you talked to us.
8:30 last night. So.
Yeah. What are you thinking about the implications of a rather more selfish America first foreign policy?
Well, we have to take Mr. Trump at his word, and it's going to be very interesting to see his appointments for Secretary of State and Director of the CIA and all these key positions and Department for the Secretary of Defense, etc. His vision of the world is quite different, of course, from the previous administration. He describes himself as something of an enemy of multilateralism, unless any multilateral arrangement reflects America's core interests. So it's very much an America first approach. With we shouldn't exaggerate to some degree what Mr. Trump is going to do. He's certainly going to make an impact in places we've considered before, like Ukraine and possibly Taiwan. His more transactional approach to foreign policy. But he will share a belief in US exceptionalism with democratic leaders, and he will also share a belief with them in US primacy. The thing that's interesting about foreign affairs, of course, is that many presidents are defined not by what they say they're going to do, but how they respond to unanticipated events. And we're sitting here, but for all we know, Mr. Trump, as soon as he gets in office, he may, within the first 3 months, be confronted by something analysts sometimes call a black swan event, something that, and it'll be interesting to see how he reacts to that. I think for small countries and middle powers, and particularly liberal democracies, the outlook at the moment doesn't seem very promising. Mr. Trump has made it quite clear that he wants to assert America's interests in every possible way. And he hasn't got much time for alliances, it would seem, unless they work in America's favour. In other words, they might very much reflect America's preferences. But for the majority of countries in the world, international institutions are important because they give them a voice at the table. And, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Another thing that I think Mr. Trump's going to have to come to terms with, and what I found interesting during his campaign, and I was listening carefully to what Elaine was saying, Mr. Trump repeatedly said, I'll fix this, and I'll fix that, and I'll fix this. In fact, his campaign slogan was, Trump will fix it, or something like that. And the problem is that the world now is completely different as it was even a few decades ago. And what I mean by that is that many of the problems confronting America are simply too big for America to fix on their own, however determined their president is. Climate change, global pandemics, transnational terrorism, these problems can't be fixed by US primacy. So Mr. Trump is going to have to grapple with this. I know he said he's going to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord at the first opportunity. But he is going to have to, if extreme weather continues to confront the United States, he is going to have to get his head around this problem in some shape or form. So he's going to be tested. And quite frankly, from a point of view of liberal democracies, I think the logical thing that many liberal democracies, including our own, I think they're going to have to exert more agency. They can no longer depend on the United States to represent their interests in the way that they have in the past. And this will particularly apply to the Europeans. I think they've got some quite tough decisions to make because Mr. Trump's vision of American primacy and America first doesn't really accommodate too much common interest.
No.
Mr. Trump seems to see the world, and so does Mr. Musk and some of the people around Trump, in zero-sum terms. And there doesn't seem to be too much win-win diplomacy. In fact, it's a sort of take it or leave it. And one of the reasons Mr. Trump put so much emphasis on great powers running the world is because America is the greatest power of them all and will be less encumbered. So if America has a semi-detached attitude to international institutions. So it's looking a bit bleak, but as I said, I did throw in a few qualifications back then.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Trump may be tested in ways he doesn't expect at the moment.
Yeah, Bernard.
Just on that issue of events, dear boy, events, and whether there'll be some people thinking, all right, let's try this out, see what happens. I think in particular of Israel and Iran, and some reports I've seen around that Israel might decide that, in this interregnum, there's an opportunity to take out a bunch of stuff in Iran and hope for some sort of support or at least no opposition. And then, of course, you've got Russia and China as well. But firstly, on Israel, do we have a sense of how Trump might react or how Biden might react in the next couple of months?
Well,
Well,
just on the Trump,
that's a very interesting. Sorry, let's just break it up because otherwise we'll lose this. That point you just made about Biden, is it feasible for Biden to do anything at all, Robert, in that conflict? Sorry, Bernard. And then we'll go back to
he
you.
may well think he's got the prerogative to do so because technically Mr. Trump's administration does not begin until I think round about January the 20th or thereabouts.
Right.
And so he may well think that he's got to do a few things before he relinquishes the White House. So that may be interesting. I think Harris and Biden, they send a letter to Mr. Netanyahu saying that he had a month to make sure that food was getting through to people in Gaza and to lift the siege around northern Gaza. No signs of that happening. But one thing I would say about Trump, he is so mercurial and unpredictable. Many people believe that, because Netanyahu and many people in Israel apparently delighted by Trump's election, they're assuming that Mr. Trump is going to do everything they want. But, in the course of the election, he cut a very interesting deal with Arab Americans in Michigan, which paid off spectacularly for him. Most Arab Americans in Michigan voted. Dearborn, very big Arab American community, voted for Mr. Trump. And apparently it was a 5-point agreement between the leadership of that community and Mr. Trump's campaign. And Mr. Trump met with them personally, and he said he gave them a solemn commitment that he would try and end the suffering as soon as he can. Now, that may not sit comfortably with Mr. Netanyahu's vision for the guy. He doesn't have a day after. So it's a bit of an unknown quantity. Of course,
Yeah.
Mr. Trump may disregard any deals he made during the course of the election campaign and just say, I'll do my best sort of thing, but he won't feel committed to it.
He's also the man, though, Robert, who has said to Netanyahu, do what you feel you need. He's also the person the president who recognized the Israeli control of the Golan Heights, and also
the move to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to fear the worst with Mr. Trump with regard to the Middle East situation. But he did get very irritated with Netanyahu towards the end of his own administration, and he's publicly said that. And so, Mr. Trump can fall out with people. He can have love letters with them, and then he can fall out with them. So he can be slighted by things that wouldn't worry other people. So we'll just have to watch this space. It may not go quite according to script. And, I mean, will he continue? I think in his first administration, his view on the two-state solution was the two parties themselves have to make that work. But of course, that's a recipe for inaction because the Palestinians are occupied. So they don't really have a leadership that can autonomously act in their interest. So that's a problem. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I think, the fascinating thing about Trump is that he does like deal making. And some commentators are predicting he'll be looking to revive the normalization of relations between Israel and some of its Arab neighbors, including
definitely.
Saudi Arabia.
Yep.
I don't think that's going to happen without, and the Saudis have said this on record, without the Palestinians getting a state. So in that sense, Hamas, that horrific terrorist attack on Israel, has probably changed the parameters of that particular diplomatic debate.
Elaine, how about we just bring you in, and you and Robert in a sense. What about Ukraine? What are you reading on the Ukraine aspect. You're a former Reuters correspondent in Kiev. You've seen Zelensky's talk about power. I've seen some people suggesting that Biden could unblock or be less hesitant on what he supplies to Ukraine, but it's really only 3 months.
Yeah, and it takes a long time to build these kinds of things up. So, I mean, I honestly don't know. I can't exactly envisage what Biden could do in such a short time frame that would, materially change the circumstances. What stood out for me was the speed with which Zelensky extended an extremely warm congratulatory message
Very
to Trump,
wise.
which of course you would expect and was not daft. But we just don't know. I mean, Trump will do what he's going to do, and obviously he's very worried. Zelensky's obviously
But
extremely
is this
worried.
something? I mean, we're getting into winter. It's very difficult. What would you say are the chances of Zelensky changing the situation on the ground between now and January the 20th?
I mean, the biggest concern, over the winter time is absolutely power supply, and the possibility that the entire country could be left without power for extended periods. I frankly don't see how he can change the calculus on the ground quickly in the coming weeks.
Robert, what are you thinking about Ukraine in terms of the sort of mechanism where we might end up? Medvedev. I think we've seen Peskov and Medvedev talk about Trump's election, but we haven't seen Putin yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Elaine. The only thing I would say is that there have been some unconfirmed noises in Washington that the introduction of the 11,000 or so North Korean troops has changed American perceptions. I think Jake Sullivan made some noises along these lines that those restraints were based on the assumption there wouldn't be foreign involvement on Mr. Putin's to support Mr. Putin's invasion, and I think that they could make a relatively quick decision, and that could affect Germany because Germany's facing the change of government in the new year as well. They've got an election coming up.
Yeah,
in
Bernard
January.
wanted to ask you about that, and we've just seen more or less the collapse of the German coalition.
But there's one other fact I'd like to mention talking about Ukraine, which is interesting. The South Korean government, which is one of the biggest arms exporters in the world, is seriously thinking about getting involved on Ukraine's side because they are outraged by North Korea's involvement. So that's an interesting one.
Yeah, it is.
And South Korea shouldn't be taken lightly. If you see, I think a lot of countries may start rallying around Ukraine to some degree once America, and Mr. Trump might be happy with that, as long as it's not America paying all the bills. I mean, I think he's quite transactional in that sense. He may not be too worried if other actors go and support Ukraine, and he may just shrug his shoulders if Mr. Putin complains. Although I've always been unclear, I was always hoping that someone like Elaine could clarify this for me. I can never work out the relationship between Trump and Putin. I think I'm not alone there. It's such a mysterious relationship. But yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering whether the Trump administration will act as a catalyst for others to step up their support for Ukraine, which would be an interesting development.
Yeah, I mean, it's more the skateboarding dog part of the interview, but part of the post podcast. But it's being widely reported, including by sensible people, that the North Koreans are in Kursk and have now encountered their first experience of the open internet and are completely indulging in pornography, it would appear. So that's, we have a secret weapon. Bernard, you're busting.
Just on how things change, Elaine, I'm curious to see that the German government seems to have almost collapsed. And I'm curious to know whether Germany and Japan, who previously could feel confident relying on the United States, don't try to go it alone. And in particular, there's been some noises about Japan, shockingly, going nuclear.
Yeah.
And whether Germany needs to go nuclear.
That's quite a thought. I mean, certainly to go back to what you were saying before about Trump kind of liking it if the Europeans were having to take more responsibility. I mean, he certainly talked a whole heck of a lot about the need for Europeans to spend higher percentages of their GDP on defence. I can't say that I can remember whether he suggested they should arm themselves with nuclear weapons. But that's an intriguing thought, which I definitely don't want to dwell on for too long.
And if we could maybe bring it, Robert, just Elaine will know less about this than you, but in a sense, AUKUS. So Helen Clark said, when we've talked a little bit about this in the run-up to the election, Helen Clark, who was going to be on but didn't want to get up in the morning, 5 a.m. in the morning, said American voters have made their choice and must live with it. The rest of the world must digest the implications of erratic leadership in the US for foreign policy and trade. New Zealand military realignment with a volatile US through AUKUS looks even more unwise. Do you want to have a quick comment on the outlook for AUKUS, Robert?
I think it's become more difficult for the New Zealand government to sell the idea of Pillar 2 membership with Mr. Trump now in the White House, because Elaine said that many people in Washington are in a state of shock with Mr. Trump's election. I've been surprised the number of people I've just bumped into here, and not just academics, but in the community this morning. I was in town, really shocked and unpleasantly shocked by Trump's re-emergence. I went into a local grocery store, and a gentleman there said, I find it incredible that a convicted felon could even run for president again. And so there is a perception that America's democracy actually is in trouble. And it's not just an internal perception. I know many Americans feel that as well, because of the failure of the judicial system. Merrick Garland is much quoted, of course, or much cited, I should say. But there is a perception externally that, that there is a real problem. And I don't think Mr. Trump's there's lots of polite congratulations going on from, good old allies like Mr. Starmer and people like that. But, their declarations, I think in substantive terms, there's not much great enthusiasm amongst the liberal democracies for Mr. Trump. And particularly his antithesis or his animosity towards multilateralism. And, America may be facing a bit of a soft power dip in the not too distant future.
In favour of hard power, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, there'd be lots of hard power, we think, in rhetorical terms, although it's interesting. I was reflecting on what Elaine was saying earlier about the election. It's very interesting that Mr. Trump ran such a negative campaign and yet got himself in a position where he could win. And yet he ducked out of it. He presents himself as a strong, decisive leader. And yet he ducked out of another debate with Miss Harris after the one encounter. I thought she might have exploited that a little bit more in the... but I think she had an uphill struggle, as Elaine pointed out.
As Mrs. Thatcher said, he was frit. Elaine, may I ask, it would be... So we're going to get a New Zealand economist on shortly, Craig Rennie, to talk about the domestic aspects. You're very welcome to stay on and hear that if you wish. You too, Robert. But Elaine, it would be wrong of me not to ask you about what you think are the lessons for media in this. There's tremendous introspection about whether the US media understood, despite all those New York Times trips to the diners of the Western states. What are the lessons for media? How do you actually how do you see what the media has perhaps got wrong in this, and also the way people have ignored? I mean, people are on Twitter like David Sachs and Elon Musk are attacking the media for having used labels like fascist and Hitlerian, but the evidence was there.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that I could say in response to this question. I mean, I think what a really big...
Keep it relatively short.
I will try to be short. The thing I worry about a lot is the lack of diversity of voices in newsrooms. I think that's part of it. And of course, the endless lack of resources, unless you're, Jeff Bezos. And then, apparently it's fine, at least some.
Who today endorsed the Trump election? Finally, but carry on. Yeah.
But yes, so I mean, I think that today I was musing on this, and I was trying to imagine for myself, well, if I were to invent just a new media organization that addressed some of these issues, and in particularly in Indiana, where I spend a lot of my time, which of course is very much Trump country, what would it look like? And I think what media needs to do is to take the things that Trump has said he's going to do and track them and do it and make, these economic stories the front page story, or the top of the page story consistently every day and measure it and use beautiful data visualizations to show the realities of what's actually happening to people on the ground, to their healthcare, in their
Elaine,
education, and
Thank
so
you.
on.
Do we also have to accept that he has really done a brilliant job over the last 10 to 15 years, really, of
Yes.
undermining trust in media by constant
Absolutely.
repetition, whether it's true or not? I mean, there are
Yeah.
trust issues, definite
100%.
actual trust issues.
Yeah, no, he's like an earworm, and it's like he says himself: if you repeat something often enough, it becomes the truth. And no question, his genius, and I hesitate to use that word, but his genius is clearly in the persuasion category, the rhetoric category. He can say whatever he likes, and people will, even if they don't believe it, they'll see there's some truth to it, and they might think it's just a joke, and it will speak to some inner fear that they have. He seems to just have this capacity to speak to many different people, delivering multiple messages at once that are, exactly what they want to hear. And he's a phenomenon in that regard, I think. But yes, absolutely
Well put.
amplified by
Very
social
well put,
media.
Elaine.
So.
We're going to move to Craig Rennie, the New Zealand economist, who's a lovely chap. You're welcome to stay on to hear what he has to say, and if you want to intervene, maybe put your hand up, but by all means. But Bernard,
Okay.
take it away with
shall
Craig.
mute
Thank you
myself.
very much, Robert. You can stay on too if you wish.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine.
Hi,
and
Craig.
we there will be a Negroni for you if you turn up at Peter's place, I'm sure. Craig, lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming on. Big news this week, not just in the global economy with Trump. We're going to be worrying about tariffs now, and he doesn't seem to be worried too much about government debt or deficits. But we do have news out of New Zealand, and as Elaine mentioned, maybe we need to pay a lot more attention to what's happening in the jobs market and with real incomes and inflation. A couple of things this week. Firstly, jobs. What's the story with our jobs market after almost a year of this new government?
Well, the jobs market, we had data come out yesterday, as you correctly say, on unemployment. Unemployment rose to 4.8%. There was some great hurrahs from some people because there was an expectation it would arrive at about 5%. But when you get underneath the data, that headline rate, there's some real weakness in the overall economy, and there's some real weakness in the labour market. Over the past year alone, we've had an additional 29,000 people becoming unemployed. Unemployment for 15 to 19-year-olds is now 20%. It's 8.4% for 20 to 24-year-olds. Māori unemployment is 9.2%, and for Pacific peoples, it's 10%. Even in places like Auckland, that's the powerhouse of the economy, unemployment is now 5.2%. So it's increasingly sort of clear that some communities and some groups are being left behind, and that the costs of the current recession and the costs of the current cuts program are clearly being felt by some communities.
And we also got numbers from the government this week on what its budget's doing. It's clear that the ongoing recession in per capita terms is dragging on the government's ability to make money, to receive taxes, which again, you're sort of chasing your tail as you cut government spending. That tightens spending in the overall economy, which means you don't get quite so much in taxes, which means you have to cut even more to catch up. So, the government's strategy seems to be, we're going to cut and we just hope that someone's going to step in on the other side. Any signs of that yet?
No, I think the government strategy could be characterised as beatings will continue until morale improves. And there will, we're currently cutting our way to prosperity. It hasn't worked every time it's been used. Every time we've tried to, I come from the country which has tried to professionalise this, and it hasn't worked, and it's not working here. We now find ourselves $700 million more in debt than we thought we would be at the budget, because GST has fallen, contractors' incomes have fallen, we've seen less consumption. All of that is being driven by a lack of confidence, a lack of investment in the economy. Those things together therefore dictate the Crown has less money. If it wants to hit its fiscal objectives, it has to cut more, and we end up in this negative, this vicious spiral of continuously cutting to achieve targets which we could actually achieve if we grew the economy. The challenge is growing the economy requires someone to invest. The private sector's not investing right now. Consumers are keeping their hands in their pockets because they're worried about rising unemployment. They're worried about rising costs. Economics 101 tells you at this point in time the Crown, the government should invest, start the economy growing again, minimize the costs of a recession, minimize the costs of a downturn, and then we get better in the future. Instead, we're actively making the current situation worse with the government's fiscal position.
I also noticed that Christopher Luxon, the Prime Minister, came out yesterday after these jobs figures to say his message to those facing benefit sanctions was get a resume, show up for the job interview, check in with your case manager, and your fellow New Zealanders will support you on a pathway to work. You have an obligation to look for work and to participate in work. And if you don't, we'll sanction your benefits. What did you think of that advice to job seekers?
I think Mr. Luxon himself put it best when he said, I understand I'm wealthy and I'm sorted, and this doesn't affect me. There are about 147,000 people who are on unemployment registers right now, who are unemployed. Seek has around 17,000 available jobs in New Zealand. Now, they won't all be concentrated in certain places. If you find yourself in Ashburton, where Smithfield's, the meatworks,
Yeah.
go under, and they've just lost 600 jobs. Where is the job? There isn't one. The job is in Australia, which is why we find ourselves again. There's now more than 100,000 people at last count who are now heading to Australia or heading overseas for jobs and for things that are available.
Yeah.
I just, wa-
It's not
I
a
just,
case of them people being unable to actually access or wanting jobs. It's the fact that jobs just aren't there.
and it's interesting that our government is pursuing an austerity strategy. Treasury has said that this will be the most vicious cuts in per capita spending ever, even more than during Ruth Richardson's years. And at the same time, Australia, which is taking our workers, so to speak, pulling people across, it is running a looser monetary policy, fiscal policy. So the government is spending more and generating jobs growth. And in the United States, this is the irony here, that we have an economy which is generating a quite strong labour market, certainly relative to everyone else, certainly after a long period of high interest rates. And it's the government itself running very big deficits and easily selling the bonds into the market, who is driving the growth. Donald Trump didn't talk once during the campaign about reducing debt or reducing the deficit. He got elected, and you do have to wonder how out of step this current national conservative government is with right-wing thinking globally when it's running such tough budgets.
Certainly, I mean, Australia put on, from memory, 47,000 additional jobs last month. The US has been putting on regularly, with the exception of the September quarter, hundreds of thousands of new jobs every month in non-farm payrolls. Even the UK is now starting to see jobs growth pick up.
Craig,
New
may I?
Zealand
Sorry.
is losing jobs. We're heading in the wrong direction, and we're heading in the wrong direction importantly because that lack of investment is delivering a lack of productivity growth in the future, and that will permanently scar the New Zealand economy, not just now but in the future as well.
That's the irony.
Let's remember, just one second, Bernard. Let's remember, Craig, that you work for the Council of Trade Unions, just so that we know where you're coming from on this. Bernard, may I ask, bring in the question just to bring it sort of in a loop around back to Elaine and Robert as well. How do you see the potential risks of Trump tariffs to New Zealand? Bernard, is that all right to ask that?
Cool.
Sure. So, I mean, certainly in terms of the Trump tariffs, the real risk there is that they go on agricultural products in particular, or horticultural products in particular, which are incredibly price sensitive. The margins on those goods are often very small. 10%, 20% tariffs essentially act as a huge disinvestment. They also force other countries to dump goods on other countries that don't have those tariffs. And so we'll start to see global trade being destabilized as other countries start to dump goods and services on where previously which were in the US, but now in Europe or in Africa or in Latin America or elsewhere. All of that destabilization has negative effects for a country that is very trade exposed, like New Zealand, and where our goods are very generic. It's not as if they're highly specialized or where they're not available somewhere else. Timber is timber, dairy products are dairy products. As a consequence, they could be very negative for New Zealand, which accepts around about $8 billion of our exports a year.
Craig, Bernard, did you see the question I just sent you?
Uh, yes, I just wanted to just ask Elaine a final question on that
Yep.
tariffs stuff, because the irony is tariffs, which Trump loves, are going to push up consumer prices and make
Yes.
inflation worse. And in theory, inflation was the reason he got in.
Yeah. I mean, it's on its face, and madness. And so I have to just say, and maybe I'm just fantasizing here, but if there's one thing that he's said he's going to do that I just don't think he's going to do, it's that. I think it's that. I mean, could it be a negotiating tactic? You know, I'm going to do this, so you better do that. To China, maybe, I don't know. It just seems on its face so crazy, because there's so many voters in this country, and you know, organized people like farmers who might not be too happy about that.
Okay, let me ask each of you, since we have this lovely Brady, what I used to call a Brady Bunch presentation, and the thing I used to do, I'd like to ask all three of you just one quick sentence pulled out of the air about your feeling, your most important thing you'd like to convey about your reaction to the Trump election. Professor Patman, would you go first? And Craig, when you do yours, say it really loudly, because your mic is not working terribly well. Robert?
Well, I'm apprehensive. I think we have a president who's not actually in tune with the way the world actually is. I think his idea about the United States could be traced to a much earlier period. I think the world has changed substantially, and I'm not sure America can adapt as rapidly as it should.
Brilliant. Apprehensive. Elaine?
So I'm going to quote the very wonderful Alistair Gray, the Scottish writer, and say what I always tell myself on days like this: I'm just going to keep working as if I'm living in the early days of a better nation.
Oh, that's almost as good as you know, believing in the better angels of our nature. Craig?
I think change is coming, and I think change in the US is coming, in that there will be changes that we haven't foreseen, because the actual Trump policy agenda isn't fully formed. It's not a coherent political philosophy. It's just whatever is the opportunistic thoughts of a person at a particular point in time. So we need to be really adroit and really adept at rolling with the punches, because I think there are going to be some over the next few months.
All right, shall we do
Thank
a
you
quick
very much.
skateboarding dog, Bernard?
Yes, please.
And also
thank
the
you.
audience is saying to you three that they really appreciate an intelligent conversation, and they feel as though they're getting something fresh from you. And Craig will sort out your mic in the next one, but next time you come up, it'll be lovely to hear you a bit more,
Yeah.
because you're always terrific, and it's got great things to say. So the skateboarding dog is about the election, and it's about a squirrel called Peanut and a raccoon called Fred. And the New York authorities yesterday went and killed Peanut the squirrel, and that became one of the biggest memes of the last day of the election campaign, driven by Elon Musk, who essentially said, and JD Vance, who said that the killing of Peanut the squirrel was an incredible example of democratic overreach of politics. There was a lot less said about the pet raccoon, but squirrel really was an extraordinary meme on this. And the reason he was shot was or killed, I'm not sure we had to shoot a squirrel, although I'd quite like to shoot squirrels, but we don't have them here. Is
Let's
that
spin it out.
he allegedly he'd been looked after for the last several years. Since his mother had been hit by a car, and a man called Mr. Longo had taken him and Fred the raccoon into his home. And unfortunately, it would appear that Peanut nipped one of the New York inspectors who came to check on his welfare, and that that was he was doomed after that. But it is another example of outrageous overreach, and the squirrel Peanut has been cancelled.
Fair enough. Yes. What a wild world we live in. I think of that Cat Stevens song. It's a wild world.
Oh yeah. As I'm sorry, as an official post from Trump's campaign's TikTok account said, "R.I.P. Peanut. We will avenge you on Tuesday at the ballot box."
Ah dear. Peter,
Thank you
thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Yeah, well, thank
and
you so
really
much.
appreciate Elaine, Robert, Craig, and Catherine for another big show. Ka kite anō, everyone. We'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
See you. Ah, God, Craig, you're right.
What's up?
Craig Temahori, because I hadn't realised that Mr. Longo and his wife Daniela earned income as pornographic performers on the website OnlyFans, where Mr. Longo has said the squirrels' virality helped drive traffic. Mr. Longo's handle on the site is Squirrel Daddy.
You missed out the good bit.
Yeah, exactly.